At brunch last December, my daughter-in-law looked right at me and said, "You're not invited for Christmas." I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I just nodded and kept stirring my coffee, like it was nothing. But on the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking. 30 years of holidays, and now I was just cut out. I'd paid for every meal, hosted every gathering, helped them buy their house. I thought family meant something. That night, I opened my old ledger, the one where I kept every expense they never saw, and I stopped paying for everything. The catering, the mortgage, the family internet. At first, they didn't notice. Then the calls started coming, fast. And that's when I realized I wasn't the one left out. They were. My name is Elaine Porter. I'm 68 years old, and I used to teach literature at the local high school. I thought I had seen most kinds of pain in life, but nothing really prepares you for the day your own family quietly decides you don't belong anymore. It happened one Sunday morning when my son Ethan, his wife Lauren, and my granddaughter Sophie asked me to meet them for brunch. I remember thinking how nice it was that they wanted to see me before Christmas, because in my mind that still meant something. When I arrived, they were already seated. Lauren smiled politely, her voice smooth as she said, "This year's reunion will be at the seaside resort. You don't need to host anymore, Elaine." It took me a moment to understand what she was really saying. I looked at Ethan, waiting for him to say something, but he just nodded and added, "Yeah, Mom, it's easier for everyone. You can finally relax." I wanted to laugh at the word relax. After all the years of cooking, cleaning, driving, paying for the meals, holding everything together, now I was being told to relax, like an old piece of furniture that could finally be put away. I smiled and said, "That's nice," because I didn't know what else to say. No one looked uncomfortable, no one asked how I felt. They just kept talking about menus, rooms, and who would bring what. I sat there, pretending to listen, but inside my mind, I was remembering other mornings at the same table years ago when Lauren was still new to the family and used to call me Mom. I could almost hear her younger voice saying, "No one cooks like you, Mom." And back then, I had believed she meant it. Now, she said my name like it was a title she didn't want to use. The longer they talked, the smaller I felt. It was as if I'd suddenly become a guest in a story I used to write. I tried not to show it, so I kept smiling and nodding, even though each nod felt like another small goodbye. When the waiter brought the check, I reached for my purse automatically like I always did, but Lauren said, "Oh, you don't have to, Elaine." I smiled again and replied, "I know, but I will." I wanted to pay for something, anything, because for the first time in my life with them, I needed to prove I still had a place at that table, even if it was just to cover my coffee. I stood up first, said it was lovely to see everyone, and told them to enjoy the rest of their day. They thanked me, polite and distant, as if I were a neighbor instead of a mother. No one asked me to stay a little longer. No one reached out for a hug. I walked out of that restaurant slowly, wondering when exactly I had stopped being part of the family I built. There wasn't one big argument or betrayal, just small choices over time that pushed me further away until I was sitting right there with them, already forgotten. Driving home, I replayed their words again and again in my head. "You don't need to host anymore?" I'd been hosting for 30 years. Every Christmas dinner, every birthday, every holiday had happened because I made it happen. I had spent most of my life making sure they never felt lonely, and now they were telling me, without saying it directly, that I had done my job too well. They no longer needed me. I guess that's what hurts the most, not the rejection, but the fact that it sounded so ordinary, like something that had already been decided. When I got home, I sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the empty chair across from me. I thought about the years after my husband died, how I threw myself into being useful so no one would see how lonely I was. I thought about every gift I bought, every meal I cooked, and every bill I quietly paid when Ethan and Lauren struggled. None of it was ever about money. It was about staying connected, about feeling that I still mattered. And now, even that small illusion had been taken away in one calm conversation over brunch. I didn't cry, I just sat there, staring at nothing, trying to understand how something that had always felt like love could suddenly feel like charity. There's a strange kind of silence that comes when you realize people have stopped seeing you, and that silence filled the room until it felt heavy enough to touch. I wrote one small note on the back of an old envelope. This year, they took Christmas away. It wasn't anger, it was a record, a quiet way of reminding myself that something important had ended that morning. That brunch was supposed to be just another Sunday, but it became the line between everything I used to be and what I was about to become. I didn't know what would come next, But I knew one thing for sure. If they could move on without me, maybe I needed to learn how to move on without them too. The drive to Pine Brook Lake took about 45 minutes. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't open the windows. I just drove, thinking about what had happened at brunch and trying to understand why it hurt more than I wanted to admit. That house by the lake had always been my safe place. John and I bought it when Ethan was still little, long before Lauren came into the picture. For 30 years, it was where the family gathered. Birthdays, reunions, holidays, every memory worth keeping. When I parked the car, the place looked exactly the same as it always did. I unlocked the door, and the familiar sound of the hinges greeted me. Inside, the air felt still. I stood for a minute, just letting it sink in that I was here alone now. On the kitchen table was a folded handkerchief with the letters E and J stitched into one corner, Elaine and John. I'd made it the year we got married. I never thought it would end up sitting there without him. John has been gone 10 years now. He used to say this house was the heart of our family, that no matter how far the kids went, they would always come back here. And for a long time, he was right. They did. Every summer, every Christmas, they came home. The house would fill with voices, laughter, the smell of food, the kind of noise that makes a place feel alive. But this year, there would be none of that. I walked into the living room and saw the same shelves filled with family pictures. Ethan as a boy holding a fishing rod, Lauren smiling next to him, Sophie on her first birthday covered in cake. There was even a photo of me and John sitting on the porch, his arm around my shoulder, both of us laughing at something I can't even remember now. I picked up that frame and stared at it for a long time. It's strange how a photograph can hold so much life when the room around it feels so empty. I sat down in John's old chair. It creaked the same way it used to when he leaned back to read his newspaper. I closed my eyes, and for a second I could almost hear him saying, "This house will always be the heart, no matter how far they go." He really believed that. I did too. I guess neither of us thought the heart could stop beating this quietly. I tried to keep busy. I opened a few drawers, checked the cupboards, rearranged some things that didn't need rearranging. I wasn't doing it because anything was messy. I just needed to move, to remind myself that I was still here, still capable of doing something. The silence was so complete it felt heavy. I started talking out loud, like John was still sitting across the room. I told him what Lauren had said, how calm she was, how Ethan just agreed. I told him I tried not to take it personally, but it still felt like being erased from my own family. If he had been here, he would have put his hand on mine and said, "You don't need to prove your worth, Elle. They know." But they didn't, or maybe they forgot. That's the thing about doing everything quietly for too long. People start thinking it happens by itself. I walked to the hallway closet and opened it. The smell of old pine hit me, the same one it's had since the first year we moved in. Inside were boxes labeled Christmas, reunion, family photos. I pulled one down and opened it. There were cards, old wrapping paper, decorations from past holidays, all the small things that once meant something. I found a note John had written years ago, just 2 lines in his handwriting. "Keep the house, Elle. It'll keep you." I folded the paper and held it for a moment. It was the kind of message that doesn't mean much when you first read it, but 10 years later, it feels like a promise you never realized you were supposed to keep. I walked into the bedroom. The bed was made, the same quilt folded at the end. On the dresser was the photo from our 35th anniversary, John standing behind me, his hands on my shoulders, both of us smiling at the camera. We'd been so sure we'd have many more years like that. I remember him saying that even when he was gone, I'd never be alone, because the family would always come back to me. I sat down on the edge of the bed and whispered, "You were wrong this time, John." It wasn't said with anger, just sadness, because for the first time, the house that once held everyone now held only me. I stayed there a while, thinking about how much of myself I'd poured into keeping this family together. Maybe I thought if I worked hard enough, they'd never drift away. But they did, and now I had to decide what to do with the pieces that were left. Later that evening, I made a cup of tea and sat by the front window. The lake outside was still. I used to love hearing the sound of everyone talking over dinner, the clatter of dishes, the footsteps running up and down the hallway. Now there was nothing but quiet. And in that quiet, I realized something that hurt more than anything Lauren could have said. It wasn't just that they had moved on. It was that I hadn't. I looked around the room again, the pictures, the chairs, the shelves, everything I had built to hold a family that no longer gathered here. I whispered, mostly to myself, "This house used to be the heart of our family. Now it beats on its own." That night, after I came back from the lake house, I made myself some tea and sat at the kitchen table. The lights were dim, the kind of light that makes the room feel smaller, almost quiet enough to hide in. I hadn't spoken to anyone since that brunch. I didn't expect to. I just needed time to let it all settle. But then the phone rang. The sound startled me. No one really calls anymore. I looked at the screen and saw Ethan's name. For a moment, I thought maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe he wanted to say they missed me, or that Lauren felt bad about how things had gone. I took a breath and answered. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice sounded careful, like he'd rehearsed what to say. I said, "Hi, Ethan. Everything all right?" There was a pause, long enough for me to feel it. Then he said, "Lauren thought maybe you'd like a rest this year. You've done enough." I stared at the photo frame on the table, the one with the four of us at the lake house years ago, all smiling, arms around each other. Back then, I thought that was what love looked like. Showing up, doing everything, making sure no one else had to. I didn't realize that to them, maybe it started looking like a habit they could outgrow. I said, quietly but clearly, I didn't know love had a quota. For a few seconds there was nothing. I could hear him breathing on the other end, a soft, uneven sound. He was trying to find words, but none came. I almost felt sorry for him. He wasn't cruel, just blind to the weight of what he was saying. Finally, he whispered, "Mom, that's not what I meant." I replied, "I know, but that's what you said." He didn't argue. Maybe he knew there was no right way to fix it. There are some moments between a parent and a child where the truth doesn't need shouting. It just sits between them, heavy and sharp. I could hear Lauren's voice faintly in the background, saying something like, "Did she understand?" Ethan didn't answer her. The silence stretched out so long that I decided to end it. "I should get some rest," I said. "Good night, Ethan." He hesitated. "Good night, Mom." Then I hung up. After the call ended, I sat still for a while, holding the phone in my hand like it might ring again. It didn't. The screen went dark and the house felt even quieter than before. I looked at that same photo again. I tried to remember when it was taken, maybe the summer after John passed away. Ethan had grilled outside, Lauren had brought her favorite salad, and Sophie was chasing dragonflies near the dock. I'd thought it was a perfect day. Now it just looked like a picture from a life that wasn't mine anymore. I leaned back and closed my eyes. It's funny how quickly people can rewrite your place in their story. One week you're the center of everything, and the next, you're taking a rest. I wanted to be angry, but all I felt was tired. I thought about calling him back, telling him I understood, telling him I didn't blame him. But I stopped myself. There's a point in life when you learn that explaining your pain doesn't make it smaller. It just gives people more space to ignore it. Outside, the night air was warm, but somehow it still felt cold. The sound of crickets filled the quiet. When I was younger, I used to find that sound comforting. Tonight, it just reminded me how alive the world could be even when you felt completely invisible inside it. I put the phone back on the table and watched the small blinking light fade. I wondered how long it would take before Ethan realized that this wasn't just about Christmas. It was about being seen, about feeling like you still belong somewhere. He probably wouldn't understand that, not yet. People who still have their lives full don't notice what emptiness looks like. I walked to the hallway, turned off the kitchen light, and stood there for a moment before going to bed. The silence wasn't new anymore. It had become part of my days, like something that moved in once no one else came around. I thought of John again. He would have known what to say, something simple probably. Let them go, Elle. Let them find out what it feels like when the phone doesn't get answered. I smiled faintly at that thought. Maybe he was right. Maybe silence was the only thing left to say. Before I went to bed, I wrote a few words on a notepad I kept by the counter. Not a letter, just something for myself. Sometimes silence is the clearest answer. I left it there next to the phone like a quiet reminder that I didn't always have to explain myself to be understood. That night, I slept without waiting for anyone to call back. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I didn't have anywhere to be, but my mind wouldn't rest. The house felt heavy, not because of noise, but because of everything that wasn't there anymore. I made some coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened the drawer where I kept old things. Bills, cards, and notebooks that hadn't been touched in years. At the bottom of the drawer was a brown leather book. The corners were worn, the cover soft from time. It was my old ledger, the one I used to keep track of every expense since the day John and I got married. I hadn't opened it since he passed away. For some reason that morning, I wanted to see it again. When I opened the first page, the year 1997 was written neatly at the top in my handwriting. Food for reunion, $230. Decorations, $50. I smiled without meaning to. That was the year Ethan brought home his first girlfriend. We decorated the backyard with strings of cheap lights, and John had grilled until sunset. It had felt like such a small thing then, but looking at those numbers now, I could see the shape of a life hidden in them. I kept turning the pages. Each one carried a little more history. Ethan's wedding cake, $800. Lauren's maternity care, $2,000. I traced each line with my fingers, remembering what those moments looked like. The cake everyone loved, the hospital nights when Lauren was too tired to smile, the quiet drive home afterward when John told me, "You're the glue, Elle. You keep everything together." I found myself whispering those words out loud, as if saying them could make him walk back into the room. But he didn't. Only the silence answered. The later years were different. The numbers got smaller. No more big parties or family trips. Just notes like Sophie's birthday gift, $45, or Ethan's car payment, $300. Even when I didn't have much, I still gave. It wasn't about the money, it was about the feeling that I still mattered. I thought if I kept contributing, if I kept showing up, they'd keep a place for me. I guess I thought love worked like an account. You deposit enough and it'll always be there when you need it. Halfway through the book, I found a folded note pressed between two pages. It was from John. The paper was yellowed, the pencil faded, but I could still read it. Elaine keeps everything together. I read it again and again until the words blurred. It wasn't a compliment, it was a truth. I really did keep everything together, the bills, the family, the memories. But somewhere in the middle of all that, I forgot to keep a piece for myself. I looked at the page underneath. The last entry I ever wrote was from the year John died. Funeral expenses, $4,200. I remembered that day clearly, how everyone came to help, how they told me to rest, to take it easy. But by the next week, I was back to writing checks, cooking meals, sending cards, keeping everything moving because that's what I'd always done. I ran my fingers over his handwriting again. The pencil marks had faded, but his words still felt alive. For so long, I thought love meant making sure no one else had to worry. I didn't see how much it was costing me to keep everything standing. I closed the ledger for a moment and stared out the window. The world outside kept moving, same as always. I realized I had built my whole life around taking care of others. Ethan, Lauren, the grandchildren, even the small details of every holiday. I was always holding something together, afraid that if I stopped, everything would fall apart. But sitting there that morning, I finally understood something I hadn't before. It already had. And it didn't break because I let go. It broke because I was the only one holding it anymore. I opened the ledger again and flipped to the last blank page. The paper smelled faintly of dust and ink. I picked up a pen and wrote slowly, not as a list, but as a sentence. If I was the one who kept everything together, then I'll be the one to let it go. It felt strange writing that down. My hand shook a little, but not from sadness. Maybe from release. I'd been carrying that weight for so long, I didn't even know it was heavy anymore. I closed the book, tied the small leather strap, and placed it back in the drawer. This time, I didn't slide it all the way to the back. I left it near the top, where I could see it every time I opened the drawer. Not as a record of what I gave away, but as proof that I was finally ready to stop giving everything I had. I sat there for a long time after that, letting the quiet fill the room. I thought about John again and what he would have said if he'd seen me that morning. Probably something like, "About time, Elle," and maybe he would have smiled that quiet smile that always made me feel safe. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel angry or forgotten. Just aware. Aware of how much life I'd poured into others and how little I'd saved for myself. I stood up, poured the rest of my coffee down the sink, and said softly to no one in particular, "If I was the keeper, maybe now it's time to set everything free." And for once, it didn't sound like loss. It sounded like beginning. The next morning started like any other. I made coffee, opened the curtains halfway, and sat down to check my email, something I rarely did anymore. Most days it was just ads or bills, nothing personal, but that morning, I saw Ethan's name at the top of the inbox. I hesitated before clicking. A part of me still hoped it was just a check-in, maybe a simple "How are you, Mom?" But it wasn't. The subject line read, "Lake House Plans." Inside, the message was short. "Mom, we're thinking of selling the lake house. You'll get your share." I read that sentence 3 times before the words began to make sense. Your share. That's what he called it, like it was just another asset on paper. Not the place where his father and I spent 30 years building memories, paying every bill from my teaching job and John's long hours at the auto shop. Not the house that held our summers, our holidays, our family, just a property, something to divide. I leaned back in the chair staring at the screen. My first thought wasn't anger, it was disbelief. That little phrase, "you'll get your share," said everything I needed to know about how they saw me now. Not as part of the family, not as the person who built it, but as someone they had to settle with. I didn't reply. I closed the laptop, got dressed, and drove into town. There are moments when you feel so insulted that you don't even want to argue. You just want to make sure you still know what's real. At the bank, I asked to see someone from property records. The young woman behind the counter couldn't have been more than 25. She looked at my ID, then at the papers I brought, and smiled politely, the way people do when they think they're about to deliver bad news gently. "I just want to confirm ownership," I said. "Pinebrook Lake House." She clicked through her computer for a while, then looked up. "You mean you still live there alone?" she asked, her voice soft, like she wasn't sure she should say it out loud. I smiled because I didn't want her pity. "Yes," I said, "and I still own it alone." She blinked, nodded, and printed out a copy of the deed. My name was right there. Elaine M. Porter, sole owner. I folded the paper, placed it carefully in my purse, and thanked her. On my way out, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass door. Small, older, but not defeated. Driving back to the lake, I didn't feel sad anymore. Just clear. All those years, I had thought the house was the family's heart, something we shared. But standing there in the bank, holding proof that my name was the only one on that paper, I realized the truth. I had built that home, paid for it, cared for it, and somehow they had convinced themselves it was theirs to sell. When I got home, the first thing I did was climb up to the attic. The air was cool and smelled faintly of dust and pine. In the far corner was a small tin box I hadn't opened in years. I took it down carefully, sat cross-legged on the floor, and lifted the lid. Inside were old receipts, tax documents, and a bundle of letters tied together with string. The receipts were all there, proof of everything John and I had spent over the years. The first down payment on the lake house, the roof repairs, the plumbing bills, the property taxes. I could almost see my younger self counting every dollar, teaching extra classes just so we could afford to keep it. And under those papers was something I hadn't remembered keeping, a letter from John. His handwriting was shaky, written a few weeks before he passed. It said only one thing: "Keep the house, Elle. It'll keep you." I sat there for a long time, holding that note in my hands. The pencil marks were faint, but the meaning was clear. He must have known I would need that reminder one day, that this house wasn't just a building. It was a promise. A piece of our life no one had the right to take away. I placed the letter back in the tin, closed the lid, and carried it downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table again, the same spot where I'd read Ethan's email that morning. I opened the laptop and reread the message once more. This time, it didn't sting. It just confirmed something I already knew. They had forgotten where they came from. I typed a reply, short and steady. "Ethan, thank you for letting me know, but the house isn't for sale. Your father left it to me, and I intend to keep it that way." I stared at the words for a minute, then hit send. I didn't expect an answer, and I didn't need one. When I stepped outside, the air was quiet. The trees around the lake were still. I walked down to the dock and looked at the water. Not for comfort, but for confirmation that I was still standing exactly where John had asked me to stay. I whispered, "I kept it, John. I kept it." The wind brushed across the water, soft but certain, like an answer carried from somewhere I couldn't see. They could call it a property, a share, a number in a line of assets. But to me, it was still our home. The only thing left that was truly ours. I turned back toward the house, the one I built, the one that kept me long after everyone else left. I didn't feel weak anymore. I didn't feel like someone waiting to be included. I thought of Ethan's words again, "You'll get your share," and felt a small, steady calm in my chest. I whispered to myself, almost like a prayer, "I kept the promise. They just forgot I was still here to keep it." That afternoon, Nora stopped by. She's my neighbor across the hill and probably the closest thing I have to a friend these days. We've known each other for almost 20 years. Her husband passed away a few years before John, and since then, we've shared this quiet kind of companionship, Not the talk everyday kind, but the kind where you just show up when it matters. She knocked twice, then opened the door without waiting for me to answer. "I brought mint tea," she said, holding up a small tin. "Figured you might need something that doesn't taste like old coffee." I smiled and waved her in. We sat at the table facing the lake. The water outside was calm, flat enough to mirror the sky. It was the kind of afternoon where everything looked peaceful, even when nothing inside you was. I poured the hot water and waited for the leaves to steep. Nora leaned back in her chair, studying my face the way only someone your age can, with a kind of quiet recognition. "You've got that look," she said finally. "Something happened." So I told her about Ethan's email, about "you'll get your share," about how I went to the bank and confirmed the house was still mine. Nora didn't interrupt, didn't react right away. She just listened, then took a slow sip of tea and said, "Well, good thing you checked, because you're still the legal owner. They can't sell a damn thing without you." I laughed a little, not because it was funny, but because hearing her say it out loud made it sound almost ridiculous, that my own son had forgotten something so basic. "Should I confront them?" I asked. Nora shook her head. "No, let them plan. You just prepare. Silence can be a weapon, Elaine. You don't always have to fight out loud." Her tone was matter of fact, not cruel. She spoke like someone who'd already learned this the hard way. After a while, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "You know," she said, "my son tried to do the same thing. Wanted me to sell the apartment after my husband died. Said it was too big, too empty, too much trouble for an old woman like me. I told him no. He pushed harder. So I hired a lawyer." I looked at her, surprised. "You took him to court?" She nodded. "Sure did. He called me stubborn. I called it remembering who I was." Her voice was steady, almost proud. "He didn't talk to me for 6 months, but when he finally came around, I think he understood. Sometimes they need to see you stand your ground before they remember you're still standing." I thought about her words for a long moment. It was strange. I spent so much of my life avoiding conflict, thinking peace came from keeping quiet. But maybe I'd confused peace with disappearing. Maybe silence wasn't always surrender. Sometimes it was the only way to make people notice what they'd ignored for too long. Nora refilled her cup and looked out at the lake. "You know, when you get to our age, people stop asking what we want. They just assume we're done making decisions. But I don't think we're done, Elaine. Not yet." I smiled softly. "You make it sound easy." She shook her head. "It's not easy. It's just necessary. You already have the truth on your side. Don't waste energy arguing with people who've forgotten it." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint hum of the afternoon. The tea had gone lukewarm, but neither of us cared. There's a kind of comfort in being understood without having to explain everything. I looked at Nora, this woman who'd lived through her own battles and still found strength in calm. "I don't even think Ethan meant to hurt me," I said. "He just doesn't see what he's doing." "Maybe not," Nora replied, "but that doesn't make it any less wrong." Her words landed like small stones in still water. Simple, clear, but enough to ripple through everything I thought I knew. Before she left, she put her hand on mine. "Promise me something," she said. "Don't let them decide what you deserve. That's how you disappear." I nodded. "I won't." She smiled. "Good. Then let them talk. Let them plan. But you—" She paused, her eyes firm. "You stay still. That's how you win. You let their noise fall quiet against your silence." After she left, I stood at the window and watched her walk down the path, her steps slow but certain. I thought about everything she'd said, about the way she carried her strength quietly, like something that didn't need to be proven anymore. For so long, I'd believed standing still meant being left behind. But now, it started to feel like something else, like choosing not to move just because someone told you to. That evening, I went up to the attic again. I opened John's letter, the one that said, "Keep the house, Elle. It'll keep you." I read it one more time, then folded it carefully. This time, I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I just felt steady. For the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't waiting for an apology or an invitation. I wasn't hoping they'd see my worth. I already did. I sat down on the porch, the same spot where John used to read his newspaper every morning. The air was cool, the kind that made you breathe deeper. I whispered to myself, "I don't need to shout. I just need to stand still." And in that stillness, for the first time, I felt strong again. The morning after Nora's visit, I woke up with a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. The kind that doesn't come from peace, but from clarity. I didn't have a plan. I just knew what I wanted to do. I put on John's old flannel shirt, the one I still wear when I need to get things done, and tied my hair back. The lake house looked tired, like it had been holding its breath for too long. Dust on the windowsills, leaves on the porch, small signs of a home waiting to be cared for again. So I started. Not for anyone else this time, not for Ethan, not for Lauren, not even for guests who might never come, but for me. I began in the kitchen, the place where most of our life had happened. I washed every plate, wiped the counters, and pulled the old curtains down. I opened the drawers and threw away things that didn't work anymore. Cracked cups, bent spoons, papers that belonged to years that had already passed. Then I moved to the living room. I dusted the shelves, straightened the photo frames, and took down a few I wasn't ready to look at anymore. There's a kind of relief in letting certain faces rest, not out of anger, but out of honesty. When I got to the floor, I knelt down and started scrubbing. The wood had dulled over time, but as I cleaned, I could almost hear John's voice in my head. Soft, but teasing. "Leave the floor shining, Elle. You always liked it clean." I smiled without meaning to. It was the first real smile I'd had in a while. Not the kind you give people so they stop asking questions, but the kind that comes from remembering who you are. By noon, the sun had moved higher, and the smell of soap filled the house. My knees ached, but I didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, I was doing something just for myself. Every wipe, every sweep, every small act of care felt like taking my life back inch by inch. I stopped to rest and made a cup of tea. As I sat at the table, I looked around and realized how much of this place had been waiting for me. It wasn't lonely, it was loyal. The walls, the furniture, the old rugs, they had all stayed, quietly keeping my memories safe while I forgot to visit them. After lunch, I went to the storage cabinet in the hallway. Inside, under a pile of teaching materials, I found something I hadn't seen in years. A faded manila folder labeled "The Lighthouse That Waited." I froze for a second, surprised that it still existed. It was a short story I'd written back when I was still teaching. I used to write for my students, simple stories with lessons hidden in them. This one was about a lighthouse that kept shining long after the ship stopped coming. It waited every night, keeping its light steady, even when no one needed it anymore. The children had loved it. They said it was sad but beautiful. I sat down on the floor and flipped through the pages. My handwriting was smaller then, neater. I read the first line. "The lighthouse didn't stop because the sea forgot it. It kept shining because that's what it was built to do." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Back then, it was just a story for kids. Now it felt like a mirror. All my life, I had been that lighthouse. Steady, dependable, always there no matter who came or didn't come. I had waited, hoping someone would see the light and turn back. But maybe I had misunderstood what waiting meant. Maybe it wasn't about being found again. Maybe it was about never going dark, even when you stand alone. I folded the pages neatly and placed them on the table beside me. The ink had faded a little, but the words still carried weight. I thought about how I used to tell my students, "Every story you write will come back to you someday." I didn't realize mine already had. I spent the rest of the afternoon finishing the cleaning. I washed the curtains and hung them out to dry. I swept the porch and stacked firewood by the door. I even polished the kettle, the same one John used to use on cold nights. Each small task felt like a quiet way of saying, "I'm still here." When everything was done, I stood by the window and looked at the lake. The light was softer now, the kind that comes before evening. The water didn't move much, it just shimmered faintly like it was listening. I whispered, "The house is ready, John." Then I paused. But not for them. For me. The thought didn't hurt. It felt right. After years of making sure everything was perfect for everyone else, it was almost strange to realize I could do something just because it made me feel right. I sat down with the manuscript again, tracing the title on the cover with my fingertip, "The Lighthouse That Waited." The words felt like an echo from another version of myself, one I had put away for far too long. I whispered, almost like a confession, "Maybe I'm the lighthouse." And for the first time, that didn't sound sad. It sounded like truth. The next morning, I planned to start rewriting it, not for anyone to read, but for myself, because the woman who wrote about a light that never went out was still here, after all these years, still shining quietly in her own way. That night, as I closed the curtains and turned off the lights, the house no longer felt empty. It felt alive again, like it had been waiting for me to remember who I was. A few days later, I decided to take a walk into town. I carried a folder under my arm, the one labeled The Lighthouse That Waited. I had spent the past 2 nights reading it over and making small notes in the margins. The words were old, but the story still felt alive, as if it had been waiting for me to come back to it. There's a small bookstore near the lake, one John and I used to visit on weekends. It belonged to his friend Raymond, a man who always smelled faintly of ink and old coffee. After John passed, I hadn't gone back much. Maybe I avoided it because it reminded me of a time when life still felt full. But that morning, something in me said it was time. When I pushed the door open, the bell above it gave the same soft ring it always did. Raymond looked up from behind the counter. His hair was mostly gray now, his glasses slipping down his nose, but his smile was the same, warm and honest. "Well, if it isn't Elaine Porter," he said. "It's been a while." "Too long," I admitted. "I wasn't sure you'd still remember me." He chuckled. "You don't forget the woman who always corrected your grammar in the book club." That made me laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from the chest, unplanned and genuine. I handed him the folder. "I found something old," I said. "A story I wrote years ago. Thought you might give me your honest opinion." He opened it, scanned the first page, and then began to read. His eyes moved slowly, the way readers do when they actually care. When he finished the first few pages, he set it down and looked at me with a smile that felt like sunlight through the years. "You've still got it, Elaine," he said. "You could host reading sessions, you know. This town needs voices like yours again." I laughed softly. Who would listen to a 68-year-old widow? He leaned back in his chair. "The right ones will," he said simply. Something about the way he said it made me quiet. It wasn't flattery, it was belief, the kind I hadn't heard from anyone in a long time. We spent the next hour talking. I told him how I'd been cleaning the house, finding old things, trying to make peace with what was left. He listened the way John used to, not to fix anything, just to understand. When I mentioned the story about the lighthouse, he said, "Maybe it's not just a story, maybe it's who you are. Maybe it's time you start shining again." Before I could reply, he reached under the counter and pulled out a small wooden sign. It was plain, just polished oak with carved letters that read, "Stories stay where they're told." He ran a hand over it, then said, "I was saving this for the right person. I think it belongs to you." I blinked, unsure what to say. "Raymond, I can't take that." "You can," he said firmly. "And you should. You're the storyteller, Elaine. You've got stories this town needs to hear." I held the sign, in my hands. The words felt heavy but kind, like they were giving me permission to take up space again. We started talking about an idea, something small, something gentle. He suggested turning my lake house into a little reading retreat, a place where kids could come on weekends, sit on the porch, drink cocoa, and listen to stories. "You don't need a big plan," he said. "You just need to start." I smiled. "The reading retreat," I said aloud, testing the name. It sounded simple, but it fit. He nodded. "See? It's already real. You've been teaching and storytelling all your life. You just forgot it was still part of you." When I left the shop that afternoon, the sign was tucked under my arm, and my heart felt lighter than it had in months. I walked home slowly, not because I was tired, but because, for once, I didn't want to rush. The world around me looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Maybe because, for the first time, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking towards something new. When I reached the lake house, I set the sign on the porch rail and stood there for a while looking at it. Stories stay where they're told. It made sense to me. The stories we tell, the ones that matter, don't leave us. They live in the places we once filled with laughter and light. They stay, waiting, until we're ready to tell them again. That evening, I started clearing a small corner of the living room. I moved the chairs, brought in a rug, and set out a basket of children's books I'd kept from my teaching days. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. I hung Raymond's sign by the door, just above the coat hooks. When I stepped back to look at it, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It wasn't about showing Ethan or Lauren that I still mattered. It was about showing myself that I did. As I lit a candle on the table, I whispered quietly, "I guess I'm not forgotten after all." For a moment, I thought of John again, how he'd always believed this house had a heart. Maybe this was what he meant, that even after everyone else leaves, The story keeps going. You just have to find your way back to it. I sat by the window, the soft glow of the candle flickering against the wooden sign. The lake was still, and the air was cool. I felt a small peace settle in my chest. Not the peace of giving up, but the peace of finally coming home to myself. And that night, for the first time in years, I didn't feel forgotten. Not by them, and not by me. Saturday morning came with a quiet kind of brightness, the kind that fills a room without asking permission. I woke early, opened the curtains, and stood for a moment at the window, just breathing in the air from the lake. The water was calm, the trees still, as if they were waiting for something. I moved into the kitchen and started the tea. The sound of the kettle was soft, steady, the kind of sound that reminds you you're still here. I sliced a fresh apple pie, laid out small plates, and set the cups on the table near the porch window. Everything was ready. The wooden sign Raymond gave me hung above the door. Stories stay where they're told. And below it, I'd added a new one. Welcome to the reading retreat, hosted by Elaine Porter. The paint was still drying, but I didn't mind. It looked right. At 10 o'clock, the first children began to arrive. Neighbors' kids, mostly. Some I remembered from the grocery store, some from church. They carried books and wide smiles, their voices rising in the soft morning air. The porch filled with laughter, the kind that doesn't demand attention but fills the space like sunlight. I helped them find seats on the steps and handed out cookies. Their shoes tapped lightly on the wood, their faces curious and open. For once, the house didn't feel like it belonged to the past. It felt like it was part of something still growing. Then I heard it, the sound of tires on gravel. A car slowing near the gate. I looked out the window and saw a silver SUV pulling in. My chest tightened, but only for a moment. Lauren stepped out first. Her hair tied back neatly, sunglasses perched on her head. Ethan followed, holding Sophie's hand, my granddaughter, now taller, her face more serious than I remembered. They walked slowly toward the porch. The children had gone quiet for a second, watching. Lauren's eyes landed on the sign and she froze. I could almost hear the breath she didn't take. She turned toward me through the open door. Mom, what is this? I met her eyes, calm. This, I said, pouring tea into small porcelain cups, is the reading retreat. Her gaze flickered between the porch full of children, the trays of cookies, the books stacked neatly by the window. You started this? I smiled gently. You said I didn't need to host for the family anymore, so I hosted for someone else. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to still. Ethan looked around, his face caught somewhere between surprise and pride. Sophie's eyes lit up when she saw the other children. Without waiting for anyone to tell her otherwise, she ran up the steps and found a seat near the front. Lauren's voice softened. Mom, we didn't know. I interrupted her, not sharply, just steady. You didn't ask. There was no anger in it, just truth. She looked down, her fingers tightening around the handle of her purse. I could see the conflict on her face, guilt, confusion, maybe even a touch of respect. I turned back to the children. All right, everyone, I said. Today we're reading a story about a lighthouse, a light that kept shining even when no ships came home. The kids leaned in closer, eyes wide, hands resting on their knees. Lauren and Ethan stood by the edge of the porch, unsure whether to stay or go. I didn't invite them in, and I didn't ask them to leave. I just began to read. My voice carried through the air, calm, even, familiar. The lighthouse didn't stop because the sea forgot it, I read aloud. It kept shining because that's what it was built to do. The children listened quietly, the way children do when something real is being said. Behind them, I could see Sophie glance back at her parents, then turn her eyes to me again, smiling. As I reached the final lines, sunlight slipped through the trees, hitting the teacup beside me. The reflection shimmered across the table, warm, soft, golden. For a second, everything felt still, like the world had exhaled. When I finished, the children clapped. Not loudly, but sincerely. I handed out slices of pie, one by one. Sophie took hers and whispered, Grandma, can I come again next week? I smiled. Of course you can. Behind her, Lauren's eyes were glassy. She didn't say sorry, she didn't have to. I could see the words forming and fading behind her silence. Some apologies don't need sound to be heard. Ethan stepped closer and touched the wooden sign lightly, tracing the letters with his thumb. It suits you, he said quietly. I nodded. It does. For a moment, the three of them stood there, uncertain, maybe humbled. Then Lauren took Sophie's hand and smiled, small and tired but genuine. "We'll see you soon," she said. I didn't answer. I just raised my teacup slightly in acknowledgement, like a toast. As their car rolled down the path, the sound faded behind the laughter of the children. The lake glimmered, the porch was full, and the air felt alive. I turned back to the group. "All right," I said. "Who's ready for the next story?" Hands shot up everywhere. I laughed softly, my heart steady, full, and as the sunlight hit the teacup again, bright, simple, unshaken, I realized something. This was my peace. Not revenge, not victory. Just peace. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for someone else to hand it to you. After the reading ended, the children began to scatter across the yard, laughing, running, picking apples from the small tree by the fence. The sound was light, alive. I gathered the cups and plates from the porch, stacking them on the tray, when I heard Lauren's voice behind me. "Mom," she said, "oh, can we talk?" I turned. She was standing near the steps, her jaw tight, her eyes sharp, not angry exactly, but cornered. Ethan stood a few feet behind her, hands shoved in his pockets, watching the ground. I nodded and led her toward the side of the house, where the shade from the old pine made the air cooler. The lake shimmered quietly behind us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said it, her voice low but edged. "You went behind our backs. We already contacted a realtor." I took a slow breath. "I see," I said softly. Then I reached into the folder I'd brought from the kitchen drawer, the one with the documents I had notarized after my visit to the bank. I pulled out the deed, still crisp from the envelope, and handed it to her. She hesitated, then took it. Her eyes moved down the page, scanning the line where my name sat alone, printed clear and final. Elaine M. Porter, sole owner. Her face changed. I watched the realization settle, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet fall of her shoulders, the soft parting of her lips. She wasn't used to being wrong. "You can't sell what's mine," I said simply, "but you're welcome to stay for tea." The words came out calm, steady, without effort. I didn't need to raise my voice. The truth carried its own weight. Behind her, Ethan looked up. His expression was a mixture of shame and surprise, the kind that makes a man suddenly remember he's someone's son. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He just nodded, almost to himself. Lauren folded the paper, slower now, more careful than before. "We didn't mean to." I stopped her gently. "You did what you thought was right for you, and I'm doing what's right for me." There was no anger left in me to give, just clarity. The silence stretched between us, thin but unbroken. I could hear the faint sound of Sophie laughing near the porch, her voice bright and unbothered by the tension adults carry like invisible luggage. Lauren looked toward the sound. Her expression softened just a little. "She really likes it here," she said quietly. I nodded. "So did you once." For a moment I thought she might say something. An apology, a defense, anything. But instead she just exhaled, eyes glancing down at the deed again. Then she handed it back to me without a word. As she turned toward the yard, Sophie ran over, her small hand sticky with crumbs, her eyes full of excitement. "Grandma," she said, tugging at my sleeve, "can I come next week too?" I smiled and brushed a bit of sugar from her cheek. "Of course," I said. Lauren watched us, silent. She didn't interrupt. Maybe she knew this wasn't her moment to control anymore. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low. "Mom," he said, "I didn't realize how much this place meant to you." I looked at him, the man he'd become. Older, tired, but still my son. "You don't have to realize it," I said gently. "You just have to respect it." He nodded, eyes lowering again. "I do," he said. We stood there for a few seconds, the three of us. No shouting, no explanations, just the sound of the wind over the lake. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close. Understanding, maybe. Then Sophie tugged again. "Grandma, come see what we made," she said, pulling me toward the porch. Lauren followed slowly, and I could feel her watching me. Not as the mother she used to instruct, but as the woman she now had to reckon with. On the porch, the children had arranged the leftover cups into a small circle, pretending it was a story ring. One of the girls had found a feather and stuck it in the center like a flag. "We're starting our own club," Sophie announced proudly. I laughed, setting the tray down. Then I guess I'll have to keep baking, I said. The other kids cheered. The tension in the air dissolved, replaced by something lighter, something almost innocent. Lauren stood on the edge of the porch, her hands clasped in front of her. When our eyes met again, she gave a small nod. Not approval, not surrender, just acknowledgement. That was enough. Later, after everyone left, I sat alone on the porch. The teacups were empty now, the yard quiet again. I looked out at the lake, its surface glowing with the soft light of evening. The house behind me was warm, the air filled with the faint scent of apples and soap. It didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt rightfully mine. I thought of what Nora had said. That silence can be a weapon. Maybe it can also be a shield. For so long, I'd believed justice meant proving someone wrong. But now I knew better. Justice isn't always about winning. Sometimes it's about standing in your truth long enough for others to see it, and that was enough for me. A month later, the house felt different. Lighter somehow. The air smelled of sun-warmed wood and sugar, and when the breeze passed through the open windows, it carried laughter instead of silence. The porch had new flowers, the kind Sophie liked, small, yellow, and stubborn enough to bloom between the stones. Every Saturday now, the yard filled with children. They arrived with their notebooks, tiny backpacks, and the kind of excitement that reminded me of school mornings long ago. They called it story hour, but really it was just us, sitting together on the porch steps, reading and imagining. That afternoon, the summer light was soft and golden. I placed the teapot on the small round table, arranged the cups, and laid out a plate of apple cookies. The house looked alive, but not crowded. Just enough people, just enough noise to feel like home again. When the clock struck 3, I opened my old folder. The pages were more worn now, corners bent from use. I didn't mind. Some stories are meant to be handled, not kept pristine. The children hushed themselves as I began to read. Once, I said, there was a lighthouse that learned how to shine without waiting for ships to return. A few of them leaned forward. Sophie sat in the front row, her knees tucked under her chin, eyes wide and bright. She'd heard this story before, but she still listened like it was new. The sea grew quiet, I continued, and the lighthouse stood tall. Every night it looked out into the dark water, wondering if someone would see its light. But even when no one did, it kept shining anyway. Not because it hoped to be seen, but because it finally knew how. When I paused, the porch was still. Even the breeze seemed to wait. Then came the applause. Small hands clapping, laughter breaking through the calm. I smiled and closed the folder. That, I said, is the story of the lighthouse. One boy in the back raised his hand. Did the ships ever come back? I shook my head gently. Some stories don't need to end that way. Sometimes the light doesn't wait for anyone. It just keeps going. They seem to think about that the way children do, not with sadness, but with curiosity. Sophie looked up at me, her voice quiet but sure. You tell stories like magic, Grandma. I felt something in my chest loosen, a warmth that wasn't nostalgia or pride, but something deeper. Because, I said softly, I finally believe them. She smiled, then turned back to the others, helping them gather the cookie tray. Watching her, I realized how much had changed without any grand moment announcing it. No one apologized, no one made promises. But things had shifted, naturally, gently. The kind of change that grows in silence. Ethan had visited once or twice since that day in the yard. He didn't say much, just fixed a few things around the porch, left early, and hugged me before leaving. Lauren sent a box of children's books last week with a small note for the next story hour. L. It wasn't an apology, but it didn't need to be. Now, the only voice that mattered was mine, steady, patient, alive. After the children left that evening, I stayed on the porch. The lake shimmered in the distance, the sun setting slow and kind. The wooden sign still hung by the door, the letters slightly faded from the heat. Stories stay where they're told. I traced the words with my fingers, thinking about how far I'd come, not in distance, but in remembering. For years, I thought my life had already happened, that I was the leftover part of other people's stories, the background, the helping hand, the quiet chair in the corner. But sitting there now, surrounded by voices and laughter, I understood something simple. I wasn't the end of anything. I was just at the beginning of something new. I looked toward the lake, where the last bit of light touched the water like a whisper. The old fear of being forgotten didn't live here anymore. The house was full again, not of guests who came out of obligation, but of people who came because they wanted to listen. That night, after the sun had gone, I wrote a few lines in my journal. The lighthouse kept shining because it finally realized the sea didn't need to return for it to have meaning. I set down my pen and smiled. I didn't need anyone to read it. I already knew what it meant. When I blew out the candle, the room stayed warm. Somewhere outside, the wind brushed past the porch swing. I closed my eyes and let it carry the sound of the children's laughter back into the house. And as I drifted into the quiet, I whispered to myself, I once thought I was the old part of a story. Turns out I was just reaching the next chapter. The evening light came slowly that day, spreading across the lake like warm silk. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels full, not empty. On the porch, the air carried the faint scent of mint and apples from the afternoon's tea. I could still hear traces of laughter, the children's voices fading down the road as they went home. I sat at the table with my old leather notebook open, the pen resting across the page. For a long moment, I just looked at it, the way you might look at an old friend who's waited patiently for you to speak. Then I began to write. They tried to sell my home. I turned it into my story. The words came out steady, sure. No anger left, no bitterness, just truth. I leaned back in the chair and looked toward the lake. The sunset had begun to melt into gold, then amber, then the soft pink that always reminded me of John. The water caught the light the same way his eyes used to when he laughed. Easy, quiet, without needing anyone to notice. For a moment I could almost hear him again, that low, warm voice calling from inside the house. You did good, Elle. I smiled at the memory. The wind picked up slightly, brushing the hem of my sleeve as if agreeing with him. The daisies by the porch swayed gently, heads nodding toward the fading light. It struck me then how much had changed without feeling like it had. The same porch, the same lake, the same old wood under my feet, but the woman sitting here wasn't the same. I used to be the woman who hosted others. Now, I am the woman who welcomes herself. It wasn't a grand realization, not a moment of revelation. It was something quieter, something that settled into my bones, into the air, into the way the light touched everything. For years, I'd believed that love meant giving until there was nothing left to keep. I'd filled rooms, planned dinners, mended hurts that weren't mine to carry. And when the rooms emptied and the calls stopped, I thought that meant I'd lost. But I see now, I didn't lose anything. I just stopped being the background of someone else's story. The lake rippled softly, and the reflection of the sky shimmered like 1,000 tiny candles. I watched it in silence, feeling the world slow down. Somewhere across the water, a bird called once, then went quiet. The house behind me glowed faintly with the last of the sun. Through the window, I could see the wooden sign Raymond gave me, "Stories stay where they're told." The letters caught the light just enough to remind me that stories, like people, only need a place to belong. I closed my notebook and set it beside the teacup. The air was cooler now. The porch boards creaked softly under my feet as I stood. From down the hill I heard the faint sound of children's laughter again, distant but unmistakable. I smiled, knowing they'd come back next Saturday, ready for another story. The thought made me feel steady, rooted. I had become part of something that would outlast me, the way all real things do. I looked out at the lake one last time before the sun disappeared. The horizon glowed for a brief, impossible moment, that fragile space between day and night when everything is both still and alive. That was my favorite kind of light. The kind that doesn't demand attention, the kind that just stays long enough to say, "You made it." I whispered into the wind, "Good night, John." The water moved gently in reply. The light dimmed, slow and graceful. The sound of waves brushed the shore like a lullaby. I sat back down, letting the dusk wrap around me. The pages of my notebook fluttered once in the breeze, then rested still. The camera would pull back now, if there were one. A wide shot. The porch, the lake, the woman in her chair, notebook open beside her. Behind her, the last streak of gold fades from the sky. The light softens. The sound of the waves remains. And in that small, quiet moment, the story finds its ending. Not in loss, not in triumph, but in peace. Because sometimes that's all the ending we need.